Everyone in Carver Falls knew who Edward Holt was. They knew his name because it was on the bank on Main Street. On the library wing that had been built 15 years ago. On the plaque outside the town park. Edward Holt had given money to most of the public things in Carver Falls, Ohio, at one point or another. What people knew less about was what he did in the evenings. Every night at 7 o'clock, Edward walked the 3 blocks from his house to Carla's Kitchen, the same diner that had been on Maple Street since before he was born. He sat at the same table in the back corner. He ordered the same rotation of meals, cycling through the week so that Carla's staff had it memorized. He ate alone. He read the newspaper or a book. He left a generous tip. He walked home. This had been his routine for 11 years. The people of Carver Falls had a lot of theories about why the richest man in town ate alone every night. Some said he was arrogant and had driven everyone away. Some said he was a widower, which was true, and had never recovered. Some said he simply preferred his own company. None of them had ever thought to simply sit down and ask him. Until a girl named Sophie did. Edward Holt was 68 years old. He had built his money the slow and unsexy way, manufacturing equipment, a company he had started at 32 with 2 partners and grown into something regionally significant over 30 years. He had sold it 12 years ago and retained enough to live on comfortably for several lifetimes. His wife, Margaret, had died 13 years ago. Cancer. The quiet, fast kind that gives you one season between the diagnosis and the end. They had not had children. This had been a sorrow they had carried together and then learned to set beside themselves rather than inside themselves. They had traveled instead. Built things. Invested in the town that had raised them both. Sat across from each other at dinner for 40 years and never quite run out of things to say. After Margaret died, Edward had tried to keep cooking at home. He had been a decent cook, enthusiastic rather than skilled, which Margaret had always said was the better kind. But cooking for one felt like a specific kind of cruelty he hadn't anticipated. The portions. The silence. The leftovers. So he had started going to Carla's. At first it was practical. Then it became routine. Then it became the shape of the evening, the structure that kept 7 o'clock from being just another hour to survive. He was not, as some people believed, indifferent to the solitude. He felt it every night. He had simply decided that feeling it in a diner, with the sound of other people around him, was better than feeling it in his kitchen. Sophie was 11 years old and deeply practical. She was the daughter of Nina, who worked the evening shift at Carla's Kitchen 4 nights a week. On the nights that Nina worked, Sophie came to the diner after school because the after-school program ended at 5 and Nina's shift didn't end until 9, and the arrangement was that Sophie would do her homework in the back booth, eat dinner from the kitchen, and stay out of the way. Sophie was good at homework and bad at staying out of the way. She had been watching Edward for 3 weeks before she said anything to him. This was not nosiness, or not entirely. She was the kind of child who observed carefully before acting, which her mother called thoughtful and her teacher called strategic, and which was really just Sophie being Sophie. What she noticed was that the man in the back corner was always alone, always had a book or a newspaper, always ate neatly and left precisely, and, this was the thing that caught her attention most, always looked slightly sad when he thought no one was watching, in the way that people look sad when they've forgotten to arrange their face. She recognized it because she had seen that face on her mother sometimes, in unguarded moments. On a Tuesday in October, she picked up her homework, walked to the back corner, and said, "Can I sit here? All the other tables are in the way of the kitchen door." This was not entirely true. Edward looked up from his book. "Go ahead," he said. She did not try to make conversation immediately. She sat across from him and opened her math homework and worked on it. Edward went back to his book. They existed in the same space without speaking for 20 minutes, which suited them both. Then Sophie said, without looking up from her homework, "What's the book about?" Edward looked at her over his reading glasses. "A man who builds a lighthouse." Is it good? Not especially, he said. But I'm 2/3 through, so I'll finish it. Sophie considered this. My dad never finished books he didn't like, she said. He said life was too short. Your dad sounds like an optimist, Edward said. He moved to Cincinnati, Sophie said, with the matter-of-fact delivery of a child who has processed something and arrived at an exit on the other side. So. Edward didn't know what to say to that. He said, I'm Edward. I know, she said. Your name is on the library. I'm Sophie. I know, he said. Your mother works here. She looked up then. Studied him briefly. You know everybody's names? Carver Falls is a small town, he said. And I've lived here all my life. Sophie went back to her math. After a moment she said, what's 17% of 240? 40.8, he said, without pausing. How did you do that so fast? I spent 30 years in manufacturing, he said. Margins and percentages. She wrote it down. Thank you. They went back to their respective work. She sat with him again on Thursday. This time she came prepared. She had a question. Not about homework. Why do you always eat alone? She asked, after they had settled in. Edward put his book down. He looked at her steadily. Most adults, when asked an intrusive question by a child, chose between deflecting and being condescending. He chose neither. My wife died 13 years ago, he said. We used to eat together. After she was gone, I couldn't eat at home for a while. So I came here. And then it became a habit. Sophie thought about this seriously. Don't you have friends? I have acquaintances, he said. People I know well enough to speak to. People who would accept an invitation to dinner, I suppose, if I made one. It's different from friends. What's the difference? Edward considered. Friends are people who would notice if you disappeared, he said. Acquaintances are people who would hear about it afterward. Sophie looked at him. That's sad, she said. Yes, he said. It is rather. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, my mom has that problem too. She knows everyone here, but I don't think she has many people who would notice. She works very hard, Edward said. Yeah, Sophie said. She went back to her homework. But something in the conversation had shifted, slightly, in the way a window shifts when you open it just enough to let the air in. October became November. Sophie sat with Edward every Tuesday and Thursday, which were the evenings Nina worked. They developed a rhythm. Sophie worked on homework while Edward read, and at some point in the evening a conversation would begin, ranging from the completely practical to the surprisingly deep, often within the same exchange. He helped her with mathematics. She told him about her school in the particular detail that children use when they have found an adult who actually listens. He told her about the manufacturing business, not in a boastful way, but in the way of someone who had found something genuinely interesting in the mechanics of how things were made. She found it more interesting than she expected. One evening she brought a book she was reading for school, a biography of a scientist. She asked him if he'd read it. He hadn't but knew the subject. They talked about it for 40 minutes. Nina, passing with coffee refills, watched this with the expression of someone who wasn't sure whether to be amused or moved and had settled on both. At the end of the evening, after Sophie had gone to the back booth to get her coat, Nina stopped at Edward's table. She talks about you, Nina said. At home. She's a remarkable girl, Edward said. Nina looked at him with the frank assessment of a woman who had little time for dishonesty. You're not what people think you are, she said. Most people aren't, he said. Nina smiled, briefly, the smile of someone in a hurry who allowed themselves a moment. Then she moved on. Thanksgiving arrived, and with it a conversation that changed things. Sophie came to Carla's on the Tuesday before the holiday, earlier than usual, and sat down with the particular energy of someone carrying something they haven't decided to say yet. "What are you doing on Thanksgiving?" she asked. Edward didn't look up from his book. "The same thing I do most evenings." "You're going to eat alone on Thanksgiving?" "I generally do." Sophie put her pencil down. "That's the saddest thing I've ever heard." "It's only a Thursday," Edward said. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't a convincing argument. It was a very particular kind of Thursday. "We're having dinner," Sophie said. "It's just me and Mom. Her sister usually comes but she's in Florida this year." She paused. "I'm inviting you." Edward set his book down completely. "Sophie. I already asked my mom," she said. "She said it was up to you. She also said don't pressure you, so I'm not. I'm just saying it would be less sad. For all three of us." He looked at her. She looked back with the direct patience of an 11-year-old who has made a reasonable argument and is waiting for the adult to catch up. He thought about the kitchen at his house. The 11 years of 7 o'clock evenings at the corner table. Margaret's chair at a table he no longer had anyone to sit across from. He thought about the window that had been opening, slightly, for the past 6 weeks. "What time?" he said. Sophie's face did something it didn't do often, it broke into a completely unguarded smile. "Noon," she said. "But come at 11 because I need help with the pie." He arrived at 11 with a bottle of wine and a pie he had bought from the bakery on 3rd Street, because he had not made a pie in 11 years and felt it was unfair to test his skills on Thanksgiving. Sophie opened the door, appraised the bakery pie with professional skepticism, and said, "I said we needed help with the pie, not a replacement pie." "I've been out of practice," he said. She let him in. Nina was in the kitchen. She had taken the day off, one of the few she allowed herself. The apartment above a dry cleaning store was small but arranged with the care of someone who made the most of what was available. The table in the kitchen was set for 3 with mismatched dishes that somehow worked together. Edward stood in the doorway of the kitchen. Nina looked up. There was a brief moment, the particular social moment when 2 adults are navigating something slightly new, and then Nina said, "There's a potato that needs peeling if you want something to do." He peeled the potato. The 3 of them moved around the kitchen, Sophie more underfoot than helpful, Edward surprisingly competent at the tasks that didn't require pie making, Nina managing everything with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had run a household alone for years. At noon they sat down. The food was good. The wine was shared between the adults and Sophie had cider. They talked about things that mattered and things that didn't. Sophie asked Edward to tell the story about the time a manufacturing machine had malfunctioned in a way that was, in retrospect, extremely funny. He told it. It was funny. Nina laughed, the real kind. Edward sat at a table with other people for the first time in 11 years and found, to his considerable surprise, that he remembered how. December came. The Tuesday and Thursday dinners continued at Carla's, but now Nina occasionally joined them at the end of her shift, sitting for 20 minutes with coffee before the final cleanup. The conversations became a different shape, 3 people rather than 2. Edward also began to notice things he had stopped noticing. He noticed that the apartment above the dry cleaning store had a heating problem. Sophie had mentioned it in passing, the way children mention things that adults have learned to stop complaining about. He made a call to a contractor he knew. The problem was fixed before Christmas. He did not tell Nina who had arranged it. She found out anyway. Small towns. She came to Carla's on a Thursday, sat down across from him, and looked at him with an expression that was somewhere between gratitude and warning. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "The heating in that building is 30 years old," he said. "It was a liability issue." Edward. "It needed doing," he said. "That's all." Nina held his gaze. "Thank you," she said. "But ask first. I don't need rescuing." "Understood," he said. She nodded. They went back to their respective evenings. But something had been established, a frank, mutual understanding that felt more like the beginning of friendship than anything that had come before. Sophie, watching from the back booth, looked very pleased with herself. The new year arrived. And with it, quietly, a new shape to Edward Holt's evenings. Not every night. That was important, not every night, because he had spent 68 years becoming someone who needed space and quiet, and that was not something to apologize for. But some nights were different now. Some Tuesdays and Thursdays, he still sat in his corner at Carla's. But now Sophie sat with him, doing homework, asking about math and percentages, and occasionally about what it was like to build something from nothing. And some evenings, Nina joined them at the end of her shift, and the three of them talked until Carla's began to empty out. Some Saturday mornings, Edward taught Sophie to cook. Basic things, the proper way to make an omelette, the logic of a sauce, the patience required to let something brown properly before moving it. Sophie approached cooking the same way she approached everything, systematically and with a lot of questions. He found, to his surprise, that he was useful. Not in the way he had been useful before, not the plaque on the wall, wing of the library useful. In the smaller, more immediate way of a person who had something to offer and someone who wanted it. One evening in February, Sophie looked up from her homework and said, "You don't look sad anymore." He looked at her. "When did I look sad?" "When you thought no one was watching," she said. "You don't do that anymore." Edward was quiet for a moment. He thought about the window. How it had opened slowly, at first just enough for a draft, then wider, then wide enough that the room had changed temperature entirely. He thought about Margaret, who had always told him that the antidote to loneliness was not necessarily another person, but rather allowing the people already present to actually reach you. "I suppose I don't," he said. Sophie went back to her homework. The diner was warm around them. Nina moved through the tables in the background. The evening went on. And the richest man in Carver Falls ate dinner with people who had noticed him, not because of the name on the library, not because of the plaque in the park, but because a practical, thoughtful 11-year-old had picked up her homework and walked across a room. Sometimes that is all it takes. Someone willing to close the distance.